Very excited to have a series of exciting talks in this session. So without wasting any time, let's begin with our first talk by Eamon Jalal. As usual, we'll have 30 minutes for each talk. First 15 minutes are for the presentation, which are then followed by comments by the discussant, and then we'll open up for discussion. So Eamon, take us away.
Okay. Thanks a lot for having me here. I'm going to be presenting work that's joint with Paul Simpson, who is a PhD student as well at the LSE, and fantastic research assistants by Zara and Isra, who are also here. Okay, so over the years, we know that climate change has been making extreme weather events, natural disasters, more severe in their magnitude, as well as more unprecedented in the locations in which they're being experienced. Rural poor households, especially in developing countries, are disproportionately affected, and we want to understand how they cope with the after effects of something that's large scale and unprecedented, given that they have various resource constraints that prevent them from responding to something unforeseen. We do this in the context of the floods in Pakistan, which this audience I don't think needs much of a reminder, but in 2022, about a third of the country was inundated with water, and these floods were not only severe, but also unprecedented compared to all of the previous floods in Pakistan's history. So in 2010, were the worst floods in Pakistan's history, and in 2022, the floods that were experienced were twice as severe. Also, they were unprecedented in the spatial pattern of the rain. So the epicenter was the province of Sindh, which historically doesn't receive that much rain, but this year it received 500% above its historical average. So in this context, we're going to be trying to understand how large-scale and unprecedented floods impact the rural poor, what actions these households take to cope with the consequences of the shock, and whether these households make any forward-looking adaptation investments beyond just immediate coping in the aftermath of the floods. We do this using panel data on about 5,100 poor and rural households across 6 districts in Sindh. We sample these households based on their pre-flood characteristics, and then we track them 1 year after the floods, and then plan to continue tracking them for another 2 years. It's important to note that we're not going to be looking at the effects of being flooded compared to the effects of not being flooded. Rather, we're going to be looking at the effects of more intense floods compared to less intense floods. So we're going to be exploiting local variation in flooding rather than variation in flood versus no floods. And that's important because a lot of the country was flooded. So in order to have comparable control group, it has to be local variation. But B, that might mean that we're going to be underestimating the impacts of floods. So I don't want to unintentionally suggest that the floods were not as severe as my results might suggest. Okay, so in terms of data, we have some baseline data, which is a geotagged census of all poor households in the 6 districts that we're working, which we obtained through our partnership with the NGO that helped us collect this data. This NGO, for its targeting mechanisms, collected this data on the location, the asset holdings, and the household member occupation and education status in 2017. We use this data as our sampling frame and also to do baseline balance tests. We then collect post-flood data, which is what I'm going to be showing you today, 1 year after the floods. We also have from the government administrative data based on government inspections of all properties in Sindh to look at the extent of damage that those properties sustain. So we have some objective measures as well of flood damages. And finally, we have a bunch of satellite data. So just to emphasize again that we're not looking at the impacts of being flooded versus non-flooded, you can see that in our sample, about 91% of the people experienced flash floods or excess rain. So pretty much everyone experienced some degree of flooding. So we're going to use instead intensive margin variation in flooding, of which there is a lot. So flood duration varied anywhere between 0 and 7 months. Peak floodwater depth was anywhere between 0 and 7 feet. While everyone reports that they experienced floods, only 41% of the households evacuated, and so on. Again, this means that the types of effects which were experienced across our sample, regardless of flood intensity, for example, almost everyone in our sample had their house fully or partially damaged. Almost everyone had a household member who fell sick as a result of the floods. Those types of effects that affect the whole sample we're not going to be able to pick up on. That doesn't mean that they don't exist. All right. As I mentioned earlier, these floods were driven by immense rainfall, but that's interacted with the fact that Sindh itself is a low-lying and flat land, and especially these black polygons, which is where we draw a sample from, is some of the lowest-lying area in the entire country. So given that, when there's immense rain on low-lying and flat land, it means water finds it harder to drain away, and that's why we have a lot of inundation. Motivated by that, we measure floods as the interaction of rain and local gradient. We use this satellite-based measure as a preferred way of measuring floods because self-reported data that we collect can, of course, be biased. And satellite data on flood extent itself, like the realized level of flooding, we believe is endogenous because it is correlated not just with these natural factors like rain and gradient, but also man-made factors like the quality of local flood defenses, which are, of course, correlated with other unobservables, which would be on our left-hand side. So we proxy for floods using the interaction of rain and topography. Let me speak more specifically about our specification. So beta 1 is our coefficient of interest, which is the interaction of rain in the summer of 2022 in a 10 by 10 pixel around the GPS coordinate of the household, where the household lived before the floods, interacted with the share of that pixel, which was flat, controlling, of course, for rain and flat land. And then we also control for two other things. We control for historical exposure to floods, because of course, if you've historically been exposed to more floods, you may have already adapted in a number of ways to flooding. We also control for historical rain, because rain itself can be correlated with how people sort across space, for example, through its impacts on agricultural yields. So we're really looking at the residual shock. We're looking at how much excess rain you received, controlling for past exposure to flooding, controlling for past historical rain, and district fixed effects. And standard errors at the moment are going to be clustered at the settlement level, of which we have about 1,800, and we're going to do more careful accounting for spatial dependence using Conley errors later. So our identifying assumption, given that we are proxying for floods using rain and topography, conditioning on past exposure to floods, conditioning on historical rain, is that conditionally, we think that households which were exposed to more versus less flooding within the province of Sindh, specifically within our sample, specifically rural poor households, their outcomes would have evolved similarly in the absence of floods. So in the tables that I'm going to be showing you, I'm really going to be showing you the beta coefficient for simplicity on this interaction of rain in 2022 times flat land, and specifically this is to make the magnitude of the effects interpretable. They're going to reflect the change in going from the 15th percentile of our treatment variable to the 75th percentile of our treatment variable. One of our concerns was that this is a baseline. We're using 2017 data, and hence we may go back after the floods given the level of displacement that there was and not find anyone. We found 88% of the households where we expected to find them, and of the 12% that we could not find, only 10% were reported to have migrated after the floods. Attrition and a bunch of baseline household characteristics as well as village characteristics are balanced on our treatment. Just to give you a sense of how big is this relative difference in high versus low flood that we're exploiting. Here I'm using administrative data from the government on property damages, which is at the UC level. And in this UC level regression, which is aggregated from all properties in that UC, we see that in the bottom 15th percentile, about 29% of the households were fully damaged by the floods. And our flood shock measure is the impact of going from that to an increase of about 6 percentage points. So when you look at the rest of the results, you should bear in mind that the flood shock is about that size. This measure is positively correlated with various self-reported measures of flood intensity, for example, whether household members evacuated, how far they were displaced, what was the peak flood water depth, and what was the flood duration. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to a bunch of results. First, I'm going to talk about labor market outcomes. Then I'm going to talk about other margins of adjustment. Then taking both of those into account, we're going to try to look at what is the net impact on consumption and assets. All right, so I'm going to show a bunch of results which to me suggest that there was overall reduced demand for labor in the areas that experience more severe floods. So we see that there is a decline in the probability that working age men and women work for others. which then translates into a decline in the probability that they're employed and a decline in the probability that they're in the labor force. There's some substitution away from working for others towards self-employment. And then for those who drop out of the labor force, there's an increase in the likelihood that they're unpaid helpers in household enterprises. Next, I'm going to decompose this by gender to try and understand who's driving the effects. So you can see that for both men and women, there's a decline in the probability that they work for others, hence in the probability that they're employed or in the labor force. But it's really the men who are able to substitute away from working for others towards self-employment. Women don't have the same opportunities. Women, therefore, either just become unemployed, or they're the ones who are driving this result, that there is an increase in the number of people who are unpaid household helpers in the aftermath of the floods. So the reason I think that this is, in general, a bit suggestive of reduced labor demand is because this type of a story of shifting from working for others to self-employment indicates a degree of labor rationing. And then the fact that women are not able to do that suggests that these impacts are not gender neutral. I'll show some evidence that points in a similar direction here as well. So the households who are more flooded are also more likely to report that they travel farther for work, more likely to report that they work outside the village, more likely to report that the distance to their work is greater, but they're not more likely to have migrated, like relocated entirely to another location. So you should think of this, like traveling farther for work, working outside the village, as more of a commuting result rather than a permanent relocation result. And these effects, again, are driven by men. It's the men who are able to respond to reduced demand in the village for work by working outside the village, by traveling farther, but even the men are not actually migrating away from the village entirely. Once again, suggesting the fact that there's reduced demand in their own villages, but women are not able to sort of adjust their labor response in the same way. All right. Okay. So now I'm going to turn to, clearly there's some flood impact. There's some ways in which more flooded households are responding to that flood impact. There are other margins of adjustment beyond just their labor supply that I'm going to look at now. So we don't see that households who were more flooded sell their productive assets, such as livestock or agricultural land. But we do see that they respond by selling household assets, such as their fan or their solar panel or their mobile phone. We also don't see, because our households are balanced at baseline, that they're any different in terms of receiving social protection programs which existed before floods and were not in any way affected in their eligibility by floods. But more flooded households are more likely to receive new social protection programs that start after the floods. So households are selling household assets. They're getting new social protection programs. They're also, more flooded households are likely to get more flood relief by a variety of NGOs and other organizations that were acting in the immediate aftermath of floods. And they're more likely to receive non-financial help from the community in the form of food and non-food aid. So some of the margins of adjustment are not just labor response, but also formal and informal social protection and sale of assets. Taking this into account, we'll now look at what is the impact on consumption. So we're very interested in trying to characterize whether the flood is an income shock or an asset shock. And here you can see that more flooded households you would expect have lower consumption, but in fact are able to maintain the same level of consumption as less flooded households. Again, remember that this is just a comparison of more and less flooded, not a comparison with not flooded. So overall, not flooded households, of course, are likely to have less consumption than non-flooded households. That's not what we're studying here. But also, it makes sense that more flooded households would have the same level of consumption as less flooded households if more flooded households are more likely to employ a variety of coping strategies, such as selling household assets, changing their labor supply to work outside of the village, or becoming self-employed, getting more social protection programs, more flood relief, more informal aid from their communities. However, we do see that their wealth takes a hit. So while it's not necessarily, it seems that they have some ability to smooth consumption, but the stock of their assets is now permanently depleted. The stock of assets reflects both asset sales as well as damages that occurred to the assets as a result of floods. So even though they're not selling livestock, they do have less livestock because some of the livestock just died because of the floods. This to us suggests that there's maybe some long-term implications. So while in the short term, in a one-year follow-up after the floods, there was a bundle of social protection, community assistance, and their own coping strategies that help them smooth consumption. But if they have lower overall wealth, that has longer-term implications for productivity. And then finally, we look at whether, we've talked a bunch about coping, but now that we're thinking more about forward-looking actions that these households might take to permanently adapt through migration or occupational change to these floods, we asked the households who had a son under the age of 15 whether they would like for their son at some point in the future to migrate and whether they would like for their son to change occupation. We see no intentions to adapt in that way amongst more flooded households. And similarly, there are a bunch of other outcomes that we expected to see changes along, and we don't see that. We don't see that these households, for example, increase their borrowing to facilitate those types of migratory trips. We don't see that they reduce their investment in education or health. We don't see that they diversify their networks outside of their villages. And we don't see that they diversify their occupations. For example, they don't sell their assets, and they're not, like, if they're self-employed, they're not necessarily self-employed outside of agriculture. So overall, we see that they're coping in the immediate aftermath of the floods with some short-term coping strategies, but they're not taking longer-term actions to adapt to these floods. And they also don't, it's not just a liquidity constraint, they also don't intend to, for their sons to take those actions either in the next few years. So I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Mohammed bin Khalid, and I'm a pre-doctoral research fellow at National University of Singapore. First of all, I think let me just start by highlighting what I think is the main contribution of the paper. I think this paper is probably the first step that one would take in terms of understanding or doing anything that's a bit more ambitious related to floods. So the first question you would ask is, how do the floods really affect the lives of the poor? So this I think is like laying the groundwork, doing the foundational work for anything that could come later on. Can I get the clicker? Okay. Yep. Okay, so now, I mean, a lot of things have been done very nicely over here. I'll just talk about some things that have sort of like got me interested, got me puzzled. So let me start by talking about identification a bit. So they're using deviation in rainfall, right? Deviation in rainfall in 2022 from the historical total as a measure of flood shock, right? And I mean, I'm not talking about the interaction with the flatland component for a bit. And so something that I was thinking about is, what if these deviations from the historical normal are not really random? So consider two different areas, one who have the same amount of total historical rainfall, but one has relatively consistent rainfall on average, but other experiences periods of floods and droughts. So, and in 2022, would you expect both areas to have like ex ante, to both to have like, I mean, obviously an area that has experienced idiosyncratic rainfalls would have a higher likelihood of being flooded. So I'm thinking about it might be useful, like like a solution to this could be to just control for the historical number of deviations in rainfall that an area has experienced. And this is particularly concerned because these areas that we're looking at are basically areas that are regularly flooded, right? And these are mostly like similar kinds of areas get flooded over and over again. Okay, so the next part is like, so now so what they do is, on top of the deviation from historical total rainfall, they interact that with the flatland, the proportion of flatland. Now, the interaction term, the way I'm interpreting it is basically, this is telling you about the effect of the rainfall shock. How does the difference between the effect of rainfall shock between the flatland versus non-flatland areas, right? And they interpret that as the effect of the intensity of flood. Now, the underlying assumption here is that basically the difference between flatland versus non-flatland areas has to be the same in rainfall shock versus non-shock areas in absence of shock. So this is similar to like the parallel trends assumption if this was like a different diff, right? And they justify that assumption using the balance tests they do. And they have these null effects on assets, right? So something I was wondering about is, like, because they're sampling very poor households, is there even enough variation in assets for you to expect anything other than a null effect over there. And then, so although they have null effects on assets, there is actually although it's still statistically insignificant, there's a like big coefficient size for poverty score. So I was thinking a bit about think more about like what does that coefficient over here really capturing. Then they also have some statistically significant coefficients for some village level characteristics, right? And that also, and this, all of this stuff is quite important because the insignificant coefficients over here is basically the litmus test of whether the flood shock measure is truly exogenous. So, and I was also thinking, if you actually think that this measure might not be exogenous, it might be worth to just get rid of the flat land component altogether. Because I'm not sure. I mean, maybe it might be different. But I was looking at the maps in the appendix, and I don't think there doesn't seem to be much variation in flat land in Sindh altogether. So if it's actually like the flat land is actually contributing much, then it might be useful to have it. Then in terms of sampling, I think they have done a very nice job of trying to maximize variation in flooding in the sample. But something is that, so they're looking at very poor households, right? And some of the null effects you observe, especially in migration and occupation change, my impression is like those kinds of adaptation might only be accessible for households at relatively higher levels of income, right? And so it might be useful maybe in the later rounds of survey to sort of sample households with a relatively broad income range, so you can look at some heterogeneity with pre-flood income. Okay, finally, in terms of the outcomes, the ones that seemed most interesting to me in terms of the results was first the fall in labor demand. And I think it's very interesting result, but I think what would be even more interesting to see how this result evolves over time. And as you conduct later rounds of survey, I think it'll be good to pay attention to think about some mechanisms. So floods might be bad initially because they destroy agriculture, but they might be useful in the long run by bringing some fresh nutrients and fresh soil. So then thinking about how the agricultural economies in these areas evolve over time will be quite interesting. And then the second result is this fall in demand for credit, right? I think it's a very interesting result, and it suggests like growing risk aversion in these areas. So I think it will be good to sort of first solidify the evidence for this by maybe using some risk games in the future rounds of survey. And then if you actually think that there is growing risk aversion, it'll be this is an area that's, I think, rich with possible interventions. Thinking about like how could you design a credit intervention that you can give to someone who has an increased risk aversion, right? That can help them get back in their life. Yeah, so those are my comments. But I think otherwise it's an excellent paper, and I really enjoyed reading it. Thank you.
Eamon, would you like to respond now or take a few questions from the audience?
Happy to take questions, yeah.
All right, so we're open for questions. Go ahead.
What's happening with networks. So it led me to think of like what kind of household is the 15th percentile household and the 75th percentile household? And so is the 75th percentile totally inundated, their house is totally broken down, or not really, they had like seepage into one room or something? Is the 15th percentile kind of their street was flooded, but everything that they owned was okay? So just to interpret what is happening, maybe if not either from going from the 15th to the 75th percentile, or maybe the min or the max of your sample, what that actually looks like, that would be helpful to know. But yeah, super interesting.
Samuel, go ahead. We can take a couple of questions, and then Eamon, you can probably respond.
That sounds great.
Great paper, Eamon. So I think the reviewer did a great job on listing some of the issues or potential issues with identification. So I'm going to sort of just add to that. I'm just trying to think through the validity of the instrument. Perhaps you can, maybe you do that in the paper, but I'm just trying to see whether you can demonstrate that the gradient isn't necessarily correlated with the list of the outcomes that you're investigating. Though in some ways, I do think that if there is there might be some level of historical sorting that happens if there is significant kind of variation in the gradient. So you might think like, flatlands, you have a particular kind of household or families that sort of relocate versus those in sort of more uphill areas. So perhaps if you could kind of speak to the strength of the instrument.
Yeah, please. Pass on to your left.
I have one quick question.
Okay.
Is it okay? Thank you, Aman, for your presentation. Actually, this topic is really interesting. I have worked on this project on pathways to resilience in semi-arid economies. So we were doing some kind of, we were trying to see the role of migration of individuals who are living in semi-arid areas. So I like your paper, it's really great. But I have just quick few questions about the rainfall data. So the rainfall data, to my knowledge, and you can correct me, we don't have like data for like specific districts and like specific areas. We have like few climate data centers that are available in different districts, and then you do the interpolation. So maybe that is affecting your results, what I think maybe. And the second thing that I was thinking that it was already rightly pointed out that maybe you're looking more onto the rural, like a household that are having like very poor income. So if migration, even in our case, when we were doing this thing, we were seeing the rural to urban migration. So there are also people who used to like migrate from like in the early morning, they go to like the urban areas and work there and they come back. So maybe, did you see like respondents that are having some kind of migration that is in the, like they come and go and come back? And the third thing is like, I have worked on the crop loan insurance scheme. There is a government policy that helps you to get back some of your loan credit back if you are registered in that program. It's kind of an insurance. It's not like a proper insurance kind of program, but it's somewhat a policy that is helping the farmers. Mm-hmm. So did you consider, or did you had a sample of those households that were also involved in that? Because I also did not got that really good results about that policy, because people were more borrowing informally. So yeah, these are my questions, and you can comment on.
I'm Takashi Kurosaki, based in Japan, but I did a field survey-based research on 2010 floods in KP. And surprisingly, my results are quite similar. So I would be very happy if you check my previous paper on KP floods in 2010. My question is that, you basically show the IV-based results using that rainfall-based IVs, but I would like to see more about just the OLS results using the reported damages, because the correlation between the reported damages and the coping strategy is very, very descriptive and informative. And after showing that, you can show the causal inference using the IV. I would like to see that kind of presentation. Thank you.
Awesome. Maybe one last question from Rocco at the front, yeah. And then, Eamon, you can respond.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, similar questions about the instrument. I wonder if, do you have access to flood gauge data and sort of inundation maps at some sort of pixel level? Could that also be useful here? And happy to speak about that afterwards as well. And then you showed some of the results on sort of receipt of social protection and other flood relief. I'm just wondering, in terms of some of the other adaptations that you observe, if we imagine, for instance, that people are not migrating because they're liquidity constrained, but then they receive some social protection, do you see any heterogeneity there, or would it be worth investigating? Thanks.
Awesome.
Okay, so maybe I can start by responding to the first question first. What characterizes the difference between the 15th and the 75th percentile? So I did this super fast in the presentation, but the first two tables were to give you a sense of how big is the gap between the 15th and the 17th percentile. To give you one example, in our 15th percentile, about 29% of the households had their house fully destroyed by the floods. And then going from the 15th to the 75th percentile is about a 6 percentage point, or about, I think, a 20% increase in the probability that your house is fully destroyed. So that's to give you a relative sense of how big is our flood shock measure and like what is the gap between those households. And for exactly the reason that you pointed out, we don't look at the extreme tails because we don't want the coefficients to be scaled by something that's very extreme. Okay, so now let me speak to, I think there are a few questions on the validity of the IV. Specifically, Mohammed pointed out and then Samuel pointed out, do we need flat land? And if we do, then isn't that a problem because then don't people sort on the basis of flatness? So let me talk to that a bit. So I think historical sorting is not a problem because we control for flat land by itself and then we control for historical rain also by itself, and then we control for the interaction between the two. So we don't think that that is a problem. But I think it would have been good to show what is the breadth of variation from the flat land times rain measure, and how do the results change if we don't have flat land at all and only have rain. The motivation for having that was, and this now speaks to why we don't have OLS results using just the flood measures directly, were twofold. One was that we didn't want to use flood measures directly because we would have gotten a lot of pushback on it's the local infrastructural quality beyond just rain and stuff that drives how much water there is and how fast water drains away. Nonetheless, it would have been good to show those results just for comparison or for benchmarking. One of the practical difficulties that we faced was we had flood extent maps, but insofar as most of Sindh is flooded, and the types of districts which were not flooded were systematically quite different, for example, the Third Desert, within a pixel, without intensive margin variation in flood depth, or the number of days for which that pixel was flooded, we weren't able to come up with meaningful variation within our sample, within districts, to run those types of regressions. But actually, having read Farah and Sharafkan's paper, I've realized that there's maybe more data that's out there than I knew about, so I'd love to chat with you guys about, So at the time that we were looking, we couldn't, in a context where pretty much everyone experiences some degree of flooding, without granular data on depth or the number of days, we weren't able to come up with enough intensive margin variation in flooding, and we didn't want to compare them to completely non-flooded units. So that, I think, answers some of the questions that I received. Next, I think there was also some concern about generally the fact that we wouldn't really see any adaptation responses because we're focusing on rural poor. So I think that that is fair. However, I guess that's part of the thing that we want to highlight, is that even there's a lot of natural disasters literature in high-income countries, which shows that events such as Hurricane Katrina were the time at which households re-optimized their location by moving elsewhere. I think it's important to point out that even the biggest shock in Pakistan's history isn't big enough to provide rural poor with the resources to be able to move out of these areas and locations, and that's partly the point. However, I think we do see that they commute, as you suggested. They're not just sitting there, but they're making day trips. They're working outside of the village, they're traveling farther for work, and they report doing so intentionally. So we're seeing that there is a response for sure. I don't think it's entirely driven by liquidity constraints, because we ask them not just, we capture not just realized margins of adaptation, but we ask for their son, who's under the age of 15. There's many years between now and when he would be a working age person, whether they would like for him to not live here, whether they would like for him to not tend to this land. And they don't also report aspirations that they would like for their family to completely relocate. So it's not even just liquidity constraints, it seems to be a preference for those areas, which might change over the years, but that's what we document. And then quickly on heterogeneity by social protection, I think that's a really good point. We need to do some heterogeneity by social protection. And this ties actually to the previous point as well. while it is the rural poor, it is not the rural, like, ultra poor. These are, we sample basically on both sides of the BISP cutoff. So we have about 50% of our sample receives social protection formally from the government, and 50% doesn't. So we do have enough heterogeneity in wealth and in eligibility for social protection programs that we can look at whether responses were different, whether households who've been receiving social protection were more resilient and stuff like that. We haven't done that, and I think that's on the to-do list. I didn't know about the insurance scheme. We'd love to know which districts it is in, and then we can ask about it in the future surveys.
Awesome. Thank you, Eamon. Big hand for Eamon. So we're ready for the next talk. Mohammed, please take us away.
Okay, so this project was part of my senior year thesis at Yale and US College, so I'm very excited to present it. So the motivation is, so we know natural disasters have large negative social and economic consequences, and once there is a major natural disaster, usually the government steps in to provide disaster aid, right? And Eamon's paper shows you that, like, social protection and this can be very useful to smooth consumption immediately after the disaster. So, and most of this disaster aid is usually provided in a geographically targeted manner. So what you would do is you would figure out which are the areas that are calamity affected, and then you would give aid to all of the households in that area. So, and there are practical reasons to do so, right? Because, like, it can be very difficult to go and access those areas and conduct a household survey, or it can also be quite time-consuming to do the survey and figure out, like, who are the exactly damaged households. So, especially for immediate relief, you would identify areas calamity hit, and then you would give everyone an aid. So, the associated concern with this kind of geographically targeted aid is, if I'm getting aid for just being situated in a flooded area, but regardless of my personal damage levels, would I have any incentive to prevent floods in the future? Or similarly, would I have any incentive to move out of the area if I know that if there's going to be a future flood, I'll get aid, even if I'm not damaged? So in this paper, I'm looking at, I studied how geographically targeted disaster aid affects adaptation behavior. And so the setting is Pakistan's 2010 flood relief program, the Watan Card program. And just to give a quick summary, so I find that recipients are 20% more likely to invest in personal adaptation, i.e. something that will prevent their household from being damaged, but they're 22% less likely to invest in community adaptation, i.e. something that will prevent the entire village from being flooded. And this negative effect on community adaptation is largely driven from non-damaged households. So the story is basically these non-damaged households who don't get damaged by the 2010 floods, but they still get aid for just being residing in a flooded village. They form these expectations that in the future, if there is a flood, the only way they will get aid is if the village is flooded. So they stop contributing towards community adaptations. Okay, so the contributions to the literature. So there's a vast literature that looks at like what's the best way to target disaster aid, and it focuses on things like exclusion versus inclusion errors and all that. I'm taking a different approach, and I'm thinking about, like, what are the kinds of expectations a particular targeting scheme generates in recipients, and how do they respond in terms of their behavior. And then there is a literature on the effects of aid, which looks at very important outcomes. I'm contributing to that literature by looking at relatively, like, onward-looking, forward-looking behavioral responses of households. Okay, so the background is 2010 floods are one of the worst floods in Pakistan, and after the floods, government steps in, it provides these Watan Card programs. So they identified villages. If a village is more than 50% flooded, everyone in the village gets this Watan Card, which is like a Visa debit card, and the cash is given of about 20,000 rupees, which is about $200 in 2 months median rural income at the time. Okay. So to identify these beneficiaries, so I just explained for Punjab and Sindh, they did use this 50% cutoff. In KPK, what they did was they basically did a household survey. They surveyed villages, which they surveyed areas, and then they identified who were the exactly damaged households. And the reason they did it differently in KPK was in 5 years before there had been an earthquake. So their teams in KPK were much more prepared, so they could quickly do the survey and figure out the damaged households. Okay, so I used the first round of data from this Pakistan Rural Household Panel survey, which is like, the first round is about 1.5 years after the floods, and it covers about 76 villages and 2,000 households. But the main challenge is that I don't have any pre-flood data, so I use some spatial data on nightlights, population density, and others. So okay, so this is just the map of Pakistan, and I have the flood layer in the areas that I have data from. Outcome variables, personal adaptation, I'm looking at 3 kinds, some like improving house infrastructure, sending a household member as a migrant to another area with lower flood risk, or diversifying income sources. The main community adaptation measure is contributing in community efforts to build flood protection, i.e. a wall or barrage that will prevent the village from being flooded. Okay, so let me just talk about this. So the main identification challenge here is that the likelihood of getting a Watan card is associated with the extent of flooding, and but that also affects your damage the damage by the flood, and which also affects the adaptation, right? So that's one identification concern. The way I address it, I create a measure of village level damage by the flood by aggregating household level damage, and I control for that. So, but the second one that's actually more important is like there could just be pre-flood differences between the Watan versus non-Watan villages, right? So, and this is something like in terms of development or urbanization. I don't have any pre-flood data, so I can't do much about it. But what I do is I use some spatial data on night lights, which is a proxy for development, and population density, a proxy for urbanization, and I control for those. And I also control for ex-ante flood risk and elevation. But then there could just be some unobservable differences, right? So what I do is I do a placebo test with the KPK province. So the intuition here is that if the effects I'm seeing are driven by unobserved confounders, right, between more and less flooded areas, then we should see the same effects in a setting between more and less flooded areas where the Watan card program is absent. Okay, but so now I don't have a perfect placebo because KPK also the Watan card program is rolled out, but it is at a household level. So I can still construct a measure of which villages would have gotten the Watan card program at a village level in KPK had the government used the same strategy in KPK, and which villages wouldn't have gotten. And I look if I see the same effects there. Okay, so this is the basic empirical specification. I have the outcome variable, which is adaptation. I have Watan card binary, and I have like village level and household level controls. I guess I've explained most of this. Okay, so these are the first set of results. So as I explained, so I see like Watan card recipients are about 20% more likely to invest in personal adaptation, and they're 22% less likely to invest in community adaptation. And the effect stays about the same even when I control for village level and household level controls. So this also suggests that the omitted variable bias might not be too big concern. And when I do the same thing for KBK, over here I see that the Watan card villages, like the Watan card eligible villages, are 10% more likely to invest in personal adaptation, but they're actually 33% more likely to invest in community adaptation as well. So this somewhat suggests that the negative effect we saw in Punjab is not driven by unobserved confounders. Okay. So now, then in terms of the mechanisms, what I do is I first subset the households by damage levels, and I compare villages and compare households in Watan versus non-Watan, and then I do a heterogeneity analysis by interacting the damage with the Watan. So this is basically comparing the effect of Watan card across damage levels. And so this is what I observed. So in the top panel, you have the subsample analysis. In the bottom panel, you have the heterogeneity analysis. So what you see is that the positive effect of Watan card and personal adaptation is driven by both the damaged and non-damaged households, right? I don't know if we can, yeah, okay. Anyway, so, but the negative effect is largely coming from, if you look at the fourth column in the top coefficient, the negative effect is largely coming from these non-damaged households, right? And you basically see the same thing with the interaction term, that, okay. And then if I do the same thing with the KPK province, I see the interaction terms over here are insignificant. So this is basically just the non-damaged houses ex ante are not actually like different in terms of likelihood of contributing to community adaptation, but especially when they get the Watan card, then they stop contributing towards the community adaptation. Okay, I do a bunch of robustness checks, which we can delve into later, and then I also deal with alternate explanations in the paper. But okay, so this is, then I try to build an economic model to understand these effects, try to understand these effects properly. So this is a simple 2-period utility model, and in the first period you get the flood shock and you get the cash transfer if it's a flooded area. And in the second period, and in the first period you also think about how many units of personal community adaptation you want to buy. And then in the second period, you can be in 4 different states. You can be in a flooded, damaged, flood, no damage, no flood damage, and no flood, no damage states. And then, in terms of probabilities, the pi denotes the probability of the village being flooded, and it depends on your investments in community adaptation. So if you invest more, the village overall has a less likelihood of being flooded. The tau actually depends, conditional on the village being flooded. What's my personal belief about my household being damaged by the flood? And this depends on my contributions towards personal adaptation and also the damage I incurred in the previous flood. That's D0 term over there. So now the main difference with village versus household level cash transfer, geographic versus household level cash transfer, is in the second column with the utility. The K will be 1 under geographically targeted cash transfer in the sense that both damaged and non-damaged households will be getting the cash, whereas under household the K will be 0, so only the damaged households will be getting the cash transfer. Okay. So I find the expected utility, take some first order conditions, I impose some assumptions for the functional forms. And then I derive the effect of the transfer on community adaptation. So I think the main interesting part there is just basically in the denominator, you have the tau term there, right? So over here, what this is basically, so if you believe me, I find that the overall effect of this village level cache on community adaptation is negative. But then in the denominator with the tau term, so if D0 is big, right? If I incurred a lot of damage in the previous flood, then the denominator will be large, but so the overall negative effect will be small. But if D0 over there is actually small, then I'll have a very small denominator, and then the overall effect will be quite large. The overall negative effect on community adaptation will be quite large. So this is actually trying to capture those two competing forces. So in terms of deciding how much community adaptations to buy, I face this trade-off, right? So if I buy more community adaptation, the village won't be flooded, and I won't get any cash, right? But also, if I don't buy community adaptation, right, then the village has a higher likelihood of me being flooded, and I also, conditional on the village being flooded, I also have a likelihood of being damaged by the floods, right? So that's where the damage you incurred in the previous floods comes into play. So if I incurred a lot of damage, then I feel like if the village gets flooded, I'm going to be damaged for sure, so I better buy community adaptation. Okay, and then I try to derive counterfactuals under the household level cash transfer program, and I see there is no heterogeneity with that term over there. Okay, so that's the overall picture over this, and I find that these village level cash transfers can be quite efficient, but they have this unintended consequence that they can actually incentivize non-damaged households from contributing to community adaptations. Okay, so as an extension of this, now me and a few co-authors, including Rocco, we're trying to think of another unintended consequence, which is migration into these flooded areas. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to compile a panel data set of settlements starting from 1975 to 2020, and then using spatial data on settlements, and then we're going to try to look at the effects of the flood relief program on population estimates, and which can have some implications on migration. So this is going to be something that we'll be working on in the future. Yeah, I think that's it. Thank you.
Hi, so my name is Isra, so I was the discussant for this. This is a very interesting paper where you were effectively looking at the effects of like how government support in the form of village level cash transfers, they have effects on personal and community level adaptation. I had two main questions or things which were of interest to me. For one, I saw that you have aggregated Punjab and Sindh together, even though they do have some level of, you could say, community or cultural differences. So I wondered if it would be interesting to show them separately as well, so we can look at how people's adaptations are occurring more richly in just between those two provinces on themselves. Another thing which I was thinking of is that you mentioned in the paper that the KPK's response was very effective because of the 2005 earthquake, right? They had an infrastructure set up. So I wondered if maybe their positive community contribution, community level adaptations were maybe as a result of that, because they've already faced a very serious shock, and as such, so they're more willing to work towards something like that. So maybe that's something to talk about or look into. In this, I think it would actually add more depth to the analysis in that sense. But overall, I actually did really like the paper, and those were two things I was more interested in. Maybe we can have more analysis into, culturally, how much differences there are between provinces themselves, and then maybe there are certain intrinsic reasons why they're maybe more willing to work towards community adaptations. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I can. So for your aggregating Punjab and Sindh part, yeah, I think I could just include province fixed effects to sort of address that. For KPK, I think this is a very well spot-on comment. I mean, the big weakness over here is because I have a single survey post-flood, and so it's construction of placebo is sort of assumes that any of the unobserved confounder is not province fixed, and if it's province fixed, then obviously what you're saying is right.
Great. We can now take a few questions. Osama, please.
Hi, Mohammed. Next word. Just a small point on the latter part of your talk with regards to the model. So when you're calculating the expected utility, you're just taking the products of the probabilities, right? Pi and tau.
Yeah.
So is it fair to then say you're assuming that these are independent? Because I would imagine you probably would have thought of, say, if the probability of damage given flooding, right? The conditional probability as
Yeah.
opposed to just because you're looking at the joint probability of flood and damage, and then flood and not damage. If you're just taking the product, are you assuming they're independent? So just a small point, if you don't think they're independent, you might want to think about looking at the conditional probability, just in terms of the model.
So I mean, I think it's, so the tau term is basically conditional on being flooded. What's the probability of being damaged, right?
Oh,
So,
I thought it was the marginal. Okay.
yeah, it's a conditional probability. Yeah, yeah. And that's why when I multiply the two, I get the joint, right? Yeah.
Thank you, Mohammed. This is very interesting. My name is Iram Heather. I'm a professor of environmental studies and in political science at the College of Worcester in Ohio. So I want to sort of push you a little bit more on maybe more the qualitative piece of your work, right? Very quickly, just for clarification, can you explain a little bit more about how the cut points for the Watan card were determined by the government? What were sort of the criteria for that?
So this is actually based on a historical document. Like, so this is like British times, I think even like in colonial times, that they had this thing that if, like, how should we designate which areas are calamity affected so that they get tax exemptions, right? So there is I think some document that exists which says that if there is more than 50% flooded or something, then the village will be notified as calamity affected, and then they will get tax exemption or something like that.
But because to me, this is sort of substantively different from the BISP card, right? Which is done on the
Yeah,
basis
yeah.
of
So
like
this
a broad survey.
Yes, exactly. So this in 2010, the BISP was sort of like they were developing the National Socioeconomic Registry. So that's why for the flood relief, they decided to not use BISP because it was not fully developed.
Right.
And in 2022 flood relief, they're doing both the geographic targeting,
Exactly.
but then
So that's what I was just coming to, is that for the 2022 floods, they've done a much more broad-based survey, and then you can actually be sure that they're using a cut point that's meaningful for you, right? That they're actually assessing household damage as well when they look at what kind of intervention they're doing or where they are doing the intervention. So, I think that piece, maybe giving a bit of background on how there might be some, exogenous factors there with even the provision of the Watan card, especially if it's coming from a historical piece. The other thing for me is like things like they're studying as post effects, like something like your outcome measure as adaptation. We don't know if there's a direct causal, there's a causality between receiving the Watan card in a previous time period and then adapting to migration, because migration is something that this region has always been engaged in, right? So are you looking at increases in adaptation, right? So if there's a baseline that if you send, say, 1 out of 3 sons to Karachi to do labor, maybe after receiving the Watan card, then you are in the future maybe sending all of them to Karachi, right? So or to Dubai or wherever. And the final piece I'll say is, for me, the community mechanisms piece is really interesting. And because I'm not an economist, I'd like to see something of maybe a qualitative story on how does this work, right? So why is there this underinvestment in community mechanisms? Is this sort of a disgruntlement factor of people who didn't receive the Watan card not now cooperating? Are there hierarchies created? Because that does happen sometimes with relief. So that would be extremely interesting. So maybe a little qualitative piece both before and after would be great. Thank you.
There's one question at the back. Peter.
So, thanks. It's really great that you use a model to rationalize these effects. I think it helps you to structure your thoughts. I couldn't help but realize that this assumes that there is no prosociality, right? So it assumes that nobody cares about the others. And this is a little bit at odds with the incentive to at all invest into community relief. I mean, in your model, you probably assume that it's incredibly effective if I spend my dollar on it, but in reality, it is a collective action, right? So, I'm wondering whether this is really the fact that nobody cares about the others is really the effect, or maybe there's something else going on.
All right, are there any more questions? Sure, please.
If I can just add to that. Hi, it's Jalal also in Singapore Management University. So we should chat afterwards. But a question for you, that as the previous commentator just mentioned, you're describing the explanation you've given. I'm willing to accept the finding that you provided, that community level adaptation is reduced. But the explanation you provided as was mentioned, not only lacks prosociality, I find it to be almost borderline psychopathic. I mean, are you going to find a single person who's saying like, hey, I'm not investing in flood protection for this village where everyone I know has been hurt, essentially, or at least 50% by that criteria, on this basis that I will get a button card? I think we can find other explanations, and I would encourage you to look at that, because this is behavior which I think not only that we might not want to see, but I think that is inconsistent with other people's findings from responses. Thank you.
Mohammed, would you like to respond to any?
Yeah, so maybe I think, so qualitative work on community adaptations, I think, so after doing this, I actually wanted to understand what are these community adaptations that people do. And I went to this area in Punjab, like at the border of Punjab and Sindh, which was flooded, right? And then I think, so the way it usually works is like, so government has sort of built these canals, like if a river or something overflows, the water goes into them. But then if there is a flood, like a wall of that some sort might just get eroded away. And then now if once a flood is taking place, now government will be very slow to react upon those. Like it will take maybe 5 years to do that. But the village sort of expects that if it's going to be flooded next time, we should do something about it. So they would then raise, like someone in the village would raise money to sort of then build an artificial wall, something that will prevent that can still control the floods. And that's something that when I was speaking to the villagers and thinking about who are the people who contribute to them, there was actually a heterogeneity in people who were contributing. So they were, like some were telling me that basically the landlords, the rich people don't really contribute to these, but really the poor people are the ones who are contributing. And I was thinking the landlords probably own land and they're going to be worse affected by the flood, so why don't they contribute? So there are there's these interesting things that go into play that I think I need to do more work to really understand what are the mechanisms over here. And I mean, so that's, I mean, for the both points about like if the mechanisms that I'm trying to tell is the story I'm trying to tell is really true. I mean, yeah, that's well taken. There could be alternate explanations. I mean, this is probably just one possible explanation that I'm thinking about. And those I mean, yeah, I could look for evidence on those as well. Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Mohammed. All right, so I'm going to start by apologizing for little adjustment we have made to the presentation schedule, and all blame to my co-author who has to leave, and she won't be here for the last presentation, and Isra has kindly agreed to let me go first. So I apologize if you plan to not attend my talk and hers, but you're stuck with this. All right, so this is joint work with Faraz, who's sitting right here, and Omar Gondal, who's a PhD candidate at Washington University in St. Louis. I'm going to start with a disclaimer that this is very preliminary work. We are still getting ideas. You'll be disappointed if you're going to compare this to the quality of presentations you've seen so far. So this is, the purpose is to just sort of do this brainstorming and get ideas from you that we are thinking in this direction, and if you think what other things we should be looking at, how we can further improve on this analysis, so that'll be really helpful. And I also want to acknowledge Aska, who has really helped with the excellent research assistance on this project, and Eamon has poached her away from us, so we are mad at her for that. All right, so let me start with some of the motivation. I think previous presentations have done a really good job at explaining why climate change is a problem and how developing countries are sort of severely affected because of disruptions that are being caused by the climate change. And obviously, for any adaptation, resilience, or mitigation strategy, it's very important that we understand how climate-related damages are being induced and what is really, how are things being affected. Okay. And of course, there is large empirical literature which has documented the impact of climate-related damages. Presentation from Eamon and Mohammed has also sort of linked at what are sort of adjustments that households have to go through when they're hit with climate shocks. However, the focus of this paper is mostly on what are some of the short-term responsiveness that the food chain or the agricultural food chains make when they're hit with severe climate-related shocks, right? And obviously, this is critical to understand that how food chains respond, just for food security, to ensure that we can provide sustenance to population in the time of crisis. So very briefly, what this paper is doing, this is looking at the last year's 2022 extreme flooding in Pakistan on fresh produce supply chains, right? I'll get to why we're focusing on fresh produces. And more broadly, what we're doing is we're employing data from multiple sources and sort of looking at how those sources were affected in terms of their supply responses, where the supplies were cut, what happened, and how the price turned out in response to this climate shock. Long story short, we find large but heterogeneous effects of floods on aggregate supply and prices, and these effects sort of persist over the medium term as well. We're still working on generating more results. So again, what I'm showing today is very preliminary. The idea is to look at how in other ways these supply chains may have adjusted given the data and other information we have. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Obviously, we contribute to various strands of literature. There's a big literature on social cost of carbon, how market responds to climate shocks, food security, and the role of intermediaries, the middlemen who are involved in these supply chains. So we contribute to some extent on these literatures. All right, so I don't think I need to spend too much time on the context. I think Eamon has done a great job at explaining, especially these 2022 floods. So let me just move ahead. I think the highlight I want to make is that agriculture is one of the most severely affected sector because of this climate shock. According to UN report, out of $15 billion of damages that Pakistan incurred, 9.2 billions were due to were losses in the agriculture sector. The crops that were affected were cotton, sugarcane, rice. We are going to focus on fresh produce crops. So within those, onions, tomatoes, and bananas were the few crops which are majorly affected because of these floods. And it's not just that the damages were caused to the crops which were planted or which were sown at the time of floods. It's also that a lot of the storage facilities and other infrastructure was destroyed, because of which supply may have adjusted due to these floods. Just to give you one picture, this is a flooded village in Matiari, Sindh. This is an agricultural village, but you can see because of floods, the whole village was inundated, and these are the farmers trying to still carry whatever they can from this village to market it. It's somewhat similar to what Eamon showed you about the extent of flooding. This is basically the timeline that we have constructed, starting with June when there was floods weren't really there. In July and August, August was the peak of the floods. You can see this is the part of Sindh that Eamon was focusing on. Parts of Balochistan and some parts of Punjab were also inundated because of floods, which sort of over time resided, and by December the flood water was sort of subsided by that time. Right. So given this context, what we are trying to do here is we're trying to look at how food chains or how fresh produce supply chains may have been affected because of these floods. And what are we doing? So first, the flood data that I just shown you, this is coming from NOAA Flood Archives. So we use satellite imagery to map which regions were affected due to floods. So this is the data at the resolution of 375 meters. So this data gives us the information on the extent of flooding. Then our main sort of information that we are relying on is this supply chain data. This is the data maintained by the Department of Agriculture, Government of Punjab, and this records the daily supplies made from a particular source to a particular destination. So every day, there are around 135 government-regulated markets in Punjab. So every day a supply comes to that market, it's recorded in that system. So we know how much is coming into each of these 135 markets in Punjab, and we know what price is being set for those produce which are coming in. Right. And this records prices for a lot of commodities, not just fresh produce supply chains. But we are going to focus on fresh produce supply chains because those are perishable in nature. They're consumed year round. It's not that there's very particular times of their consumption. And also because the data on those commodities is better than others. For example, if you focus on wheat or maize or cotton, which other papers have done so, those produce are not typically auctioned in these government-regulated markets. There are multiple ways, or there are storage technologies involved in those. So it's a bit trickier to focus on those. So for simplicity, we are going to focus just on fresh produce supply chains. As for retail price data, so this source gives us data on auction prices, right? We also want to get the sense of how consumers were affected because of these disruptions. Thanks. So am I out of time or what? Oh, okay, thanks. So we have this additional data source, which is retail price data. This is a survey conducted by Pakistan Bureau of Statistics, which records retail prices in 8 different cities of Punjab at weekly intervals. So every week we know from 8 major cities of Punjab what were the prices for a few of the commodities. Right? So just to quickly summarize, so the flood mapping that we do it spans from June 2022 to December 22. Our supply chain data is much longer in duration, but we only use data from January 2018. So a few years before the flood started to kick in, and until June 2023, we do plan to update this data source and look at longer-term impact by including data from more recent periods. And retail price data starts from January 2019. This is when this this dashboard was set up. So we only start observing these weekly prices starting from January 2019, and we go all the way till June 2023. In terms of crops, we're focusing on onion, potatoes, and tomatoes. And as I mentioned earlier, onions and tomatoes are 2 of these vegetables which are severely affected in Sindh and Balochistan. And in terms of fruits, we are focusing on apple and banana. And these 5 commodities are sort of important because everyone consumes it. They represent significant portion of average person's calorie intake. So it's important to look at what's happening with these crops. All right. So the empirical specification we have is very simple. We're using fixed effects model. And basically, the idea is to look at outcome, which could be a supply coming from a particular source of a crop C. So you can think of supply of crop C coming from source S in a market M at time T. Right? And time in our case is a weekly time. So each week we are recording what the supply was of a particular crop from source S to market M at time T. And we sort of are interested in this coefficient beta F, which is, so this flood variable is a variable that we construct, which is a normalized intensity of flood in the source at time T. So basically, the flood is happening at the source of the supply, and we're looking at how the prices in the destination are affected because of that supply shock. And this intensity variable, so obviously if it's 0, then there is no flood at the source, and if it is 1, that means the whole source was flooded. For longer-term effect, we construct flood as an absorbing treatment. So there's the first instance of flood, and that's when we say that the variable takes the value 1, and then it stays 1 until the end of our sample time period, and 0 otherwise. So we include crop fixed effects, source fixed effects, market fixed effects, and the year fixed effects. Sorry, month fixed effects and year fixed effects. So these are the time fixed effects we're using. We cluster our standard errors at the market or district level. And the identifying assumption, of course, is that there was no adaptation happening before the floods were hit. So basically, it's the floods are exogenously chosen by nature, and they're independently determined of the outcomes. All right. So very preliminary results. These are very rough, so bear with me with them. So what I'm doing here in the above panel, I'm grouping all the vegetables together, so onions, potatoes, and tomatoes. And I'm looking at this normalized flood intensity variable that you've created, and I'm finding that what I expect to find, that the supply coming from the flooded source was actually significantly reduced at the times of flood. Then I also look at the total supply coming into the market, independent of whether it's coming from a flood source or not. So I see that there was a supply shock overall in the market, which was less severe than what was observed for the sources, flooded sources. So which sort of implies that, okay, the market was hit, but maybe there were other sources which were sort of substituting the decline in supply to these particular destinations. And we observe very stark increase in prices, so almost, I can loosely interpret these in percentage terms. So prices increased by on average of 75% because of this flood, and consumer prices were also significantly increased due to these floods. I can break down this effect by the type of crop. So I can see that the onions, tomatoes, which were the most severely affected crops during this flood, they experienced the most decline in their supply. For potatoes, you can see it's interesting because obviously the decline was observed from the flooded sources, but the market really adjusted, which is because there are other regions which are growing potato, which are very good at growing potatoes, and they were not hit by flood. So we expect that the adjustments were made from those supply sources, and the decline coming from the flooded sources were actually counteracted by the increase in supply from non-flooded sources. But again, we observe increase in prices on both, auction prices and the retail prices. Overall, for all commodities, we witness significant increases in prices. Okay? We can do this, we can look at the medium-term effects. So this, what I showed you just was the instantaneous and the contemporaneous effect, what happens when the flood hits right now. We can look at, okay, over time, do the supply and prices adjust? And I think the gist is the flooded sources are eventually able to sort of cope up. It's still negative. The supply is slightly reduced, but not significantly so. But there is some persistence in terms of increase in prices. So the prices continue to stay higher, both the auction prices and the consumer prices in response to these shocks, even after the supply has adjusted to the levels that were pre-floods, right? And we can look at that by crop. We do the same thing for fruits. I'm just going to state that fruits are not severely affected because of floods, even though banana is one of the crops which was severely hit because of flood. If you look at all the reports by the government, they talk about a lot of banana fields or banana orchards going down underwater. But because banana is much widely produced in the country, that's why we don't see that much effect in terms of supply of banana to these markets and also in end prices. Right? We sort of look at where the effects are coming from, which provinces, and our priors are sort of are checking out here. So we observe that it's mainly the Sindh and Balochistan provinces, which are mainly Balochistan province, which is causing the change in supply. Obviously, there are some general equilibrium effect in terms of price settling. So even though, and so that's why we observe that the prices are increasing consistently, independent of where the source is located in terms of provinces. I know I'm running out of time, so let me just quickly state. We also look at how these effects vary by the population of the district. We do not find much difference in terms of whether the district had above median population or below median population, so we're just dividing our sample into two groups. We also look at whether the crops that were hit at the times of flood, were they sown at the time of flood, or was it the harvest time of those floods, right? So that we expect should matter. And I think the interesting part here is that the crops that were sown during the times of flood, we observe that over time, and this is the medium-term effects that I'm talking about, over time, their supply sort of adjusts, not only comes to pre-floods level, but it slightly improves. And that could be because the flood was able to improve soil fertility, or it was able to increase productivity of those lands. But again, the prices are sort of stable in that they have permanently increased, at least in the medium term. We also look at, we're trying to get at the effect of competition. So I mentioned there are more than 130 government-regulated markets in Punjab. And these markets have intermediary who exercise a lot of market power. And they can really influence prices and supply behavior depending on their profit motives. And so we wanted to see that whether having more markets in a particular in a particular region, in a particular district, does that affect how the supply responded to that district, or how prices adjusted in those districts. We find that overall the increase in prices does not vary much by the number of markets operating in that district, right? All the number of markets in a district may not be a very good measure of assessing the competition, because these markets could be huge or very less. So as one thing in the future we want to see is that how does the market size is affecting these prices, or number of agents or number of these commission agents sitting in these markets, how are those affecting these results. So that's something that we are still exploring. Right, so let me just conclude by saying that, again, this is the work that we are undertaking. We're starting on this, so we're looking for ideas. We're looking for anything that you can offer in terms of how we can further think about understanding this impact on agriculture supply chains. Overall, our results have so far shown that there is a significant effect on supply and prices, as we expect from the economic theory. Supply is going down because of this supply shock. Prices are increasing. We also observe some persistence in these outcomes. However, there are some other crops which are able to adjust better to this shock, right? So we observe this heterogeneity in crops. These effects persist. And so far, we are finding that these effects do not vary much by the size of the district or the number of markets in a district. Going forward, we are going to look at slightly longer term effects, what happens maybe. So far, we've only looked at what's happening in the first 1 year of floods. So now that more time has passed since these floods were hit, so we can look at relatively longer term effects. So that's one thing we're doing. In the analysis that I've shown you, we haven't really incorporated the effect of road networks. And that's likely have affected these supply chains a lot. We know from anecdotal evidence or anecdotal stories that a lot of these these roads were shut, because of which these trucks which were carrying bulk load of these produce could not reach the relevant markets, and that those disruptions were there. So that's something we are working on, incorporating how that may have figured into disruption in the supply chain. We're also looking at how these trading partners, as we think about them in trade literature, how they may have changed. For example, if certain regions were providing supply to certain regions, how those may have permanently changed because of these floods, and what their implication could be for overall welfare. And then this is, I think, is a relatively more ambitious thing that we want to study. But because these floods have affected relative prices of these crops, this may have induced farmers to adjust their crop choice behavior in terms of what crops they're going to go for because of different returns. And that's something we plan to come to in the future. So I'm going to stop here, and thank you so much for bearing with me. So, Eamon, you're up.
Okay, I think it's, oh yeah, thanks. Thanks so much for this presentation. I think I'll just make a broader point, which is like this session, I think, is a really great example of having complementary papers presented, because it's not just probably more cohesive for the audience, but I had an opportunity to learn a lot from their paper, which I'll talk more about. But I think that this is fantastic learning happening right here. So They look at a very important research question. Obviously, it's not surprising that I find that the research question is really important in a very self-serving way. But I think they look at a really important research question, which is how the 2022 floods affect supply chains of fresh produce. They make it sound very easy, the whole data lake that they've done to make this project happen, but having worked on a similar topic, I know that these data sets don't speak that easily to each other, and I think just that, like putting that together, is really important foundational work for being able to see how resilient our supply chains and food systems are to these types of shocks. So it's just that in and of itself is a huge first step. The way I read this paper is there's broader literature which thinks about how supply chains and production networks respond to natural disasters, how they might adapt their decisions in light of realized and expected natural disasters. I think most relevant is a recent paper by Claire Balboni and co-authors, which looks at how firms in Pakistan responded to the 2010 flood shock in Pakistan. And what they see is that there's a lot of adaptation by firms. Firms change their trade partners and their sources, responding essentially to the amount of risk that a certain trade partner poses to that firm's supply. So I think I read this paper in that broader context of like how vulnerable are supply chains and what are the adaptation measures that firms take to respond. But what's nice about this paper is that it abstracts from private adaptation to look at more aggregate general equilibrium consequences. So this is not just individual firms, especially in these contexts, like these farmers maybe don't also have the capacity to respond, for example, by changing crop mix in the immediate aftermath of floods, or don't have access to roads and stuff. So looking more broadly at GE consequences is important when there's a shock this big, right? Like climate change is making these natural disasters much bigger in their scale, which means that the entire network is shocked. So it's important to look at the aggregate impacts. It's not an idiosyncratic shock to parts of your supply chain so that you can just like move around. So I think that's why it's a really important contribution, because it looks at a very large shock that generates general equilibrium consequences, and it tries to measure exactly what those consequences are. What I think that you will get a lot of pushback on is also what I got a lot of pushback on, which is, are these floods really exogenous? I obviously am the person who is most likely to be convinced that these floods are exogenous, having looked at, for example, that these floods are quite uncorrelated with historical patterns of rain, but you at least have to, put out those arguments, and I think people will still not necessarily be convinced, but that work has to be done. So here, the concern is that variation in realized flood extent might be exogenous, not only because it reflects the quality of local infrastructure, so like how effective were flood defenses, how effective were state interventions to protect the crops, but also adaptive investments that were made in response to historical exposure to floods. One of the stories that I heard a lot during our research was, for example, one of the 6 districts was primarily a fruit orchard district, and there was a lot of effort put in to divert floodwaters away from that district because fruits are more vulnerable to inundation and would have been destroyed. So also endogenous diversion of floodwaters, because crop was such an important concern, is something that you at least want to provide more context on, but that is one of the dangers of using realized flooding directly, because, for example, in that district, there's a lot of rain, but if you look at flood maps, there's not a lot of inundation, and that's because of the systematic diversion of floodwaters from these types of areas. There might be differences in water cycle or topography that are correlated with other unobservables, like productivity, infrastructure, agricultural yield. So flood variation, if it's driven by those types of things, we may want to think about how it affects crops. We might want to think about sorting because of known flood risk and beliefs, sorting not just by the farmers, but also by the markets in their selection of sources. We might be concerned about some omitted variables as well. So the flooding of market M and its other trade partners and transportation routes, I think, Sharif, and you noted about the transport routes in particular, that is one of the things that would drive the levels of quantities that reach these markets, but also flooding of the market itself, I guess, because you have granular data to be able to know how much was the market itself affected by floods, because that's going to drive the prices and quantities that are available in those markets, past exposure of the market and its transport routes. So I think there's a lot of focus on the source, but in these contexts, where you're making decisions about where to source from, past exposure to the market and its transport routes to flooding of suppliers is important. I've gone through, I think, some of these points already. Let me talk about the last 3 points, which is prices and quantities respond to anticipated flooding, not just realized flooding, and that's one of the issues. So maybe you want to show us some evidence of the extent to which, I mean, these floods lasted from the end of July up until the end of August, and there was if there was any amount of anticipation of these rains or like the specific impact that might have on certain crops, prices will already start responding in anticipation of these weather reports, and so we may want to see how much of it is because of realized flooding and how much of it was anticipated. I think you already know this, but of course, the reason why not many people have attempted to capture GE effects is because it's really messy. So what you're trying to do is capture the direct effect of flooding at source S on market M. But of course, prices are a more aggregate phenomenon, and even if it's a different source in a different market that have been directly affected, the one that you're interested in is going to respond. That makes it really hard, but there has to be a way of accounting for spillovers, and there are ways, and we can talk about them. But also there has to be a way of accounting for demand effects, right? It's not just that markets are responding to suppliers, but they're also responding to demand for these products. So I think some suggestions that I have are considering other intend to treat measures of flooding, IV approaches, as opposed to realized flooding directly. Conditioning, for sure, I think, on past exposure to flooding and flood risk. There's data available on flood risk in particular that's quite granular. I think it would be useful to show baseline balance in the market and source characteristics by high and low flooding in 2022. Are these markets, were they at baseline quite similar, conditional on their exposure later on? And yeah, I think I've talked about conditioning on contemporaneous flooding of the destination and the transport links. I can't think of another way of disentangling spillovers and demand from supply effects without a structural model. Again, this is challenging, and that's why people haven't done it. But since you've taken on this task, I think that maybe you have really nice data, so it might be possible to do that. I'll skip the first one, but the second point that I wanted to make on results is that what we interpret as the resilience of certain crops might instead be the effect of state intervention to protect those particular crops. And there isn't at the moment even like contextual evidence on what was the state doing in response to the risk that these various crops faced, I think would be helpful. I'll just, okay, so one last thing I'll say is that going back to what I started with, which is the literature on how supply chains and networks respond to natural disasters, I think it would be useful to think about not just the impact on the market from flooding of source S, but rather heterogeneous responses by markets that vary in the extent of the supply network that was shocked. So your treatment variable could be the percentage of their network which was affected by floods. Because if most of your network is affected, then you have very limited capacity to adapt, but it would be good to show when less of your network is affected, are the prices still as high as when all of your network is affected? And that could help also tease out some of these, some of the supply versus demand things that you're considering. And also showing, I think, heterogeneity of results by baseline profile of flood risk of the suppliers. So like markets which had at baseline less risky suppliers should do differently in response to floods compared to markets that at baseline had just completely very risky suppliers. And finally, I'll say that on the longer term flooding, especially since that's where you're headed, it seems that it would be possible to incorporate more variation than just flooding since like just the, one if you were flooded from day one and then forever. For example, the number of consecutive days of exposure, it seems like from your data, it's possible to construct more intensive margin variation in these outcomes, which might be helpful. And I don't know if you have flood depth, but that would be incredibly useful. Okay, I'll send a lot of these other comments by email, but I'll stop here.
Thank you, Eamon. I'm happy to take more questions.
Thank you. Thanks so much for, my name's Rocco. Thanks so much for this. This is really exciting. Two questions. The first on you nodded to some of the potential benefits in the long term to flooding, and Mohammed also spoke about this, and Mohammed and I have spoken about this separately as well, is that some landowners expect that floods increase the quality of their land by depositing topsoil and silt. Others, maybe the topsoil is washed away or sand is deposited. So it seems like there might be heterogeneous effects on agricultural productivity in different areas. And I just think it would be amazing to produce a map with the variation at like a very granular level of the quantity of goods produced and the prices of those goods. And I think that would really give us a sense of how land value is changing after these flood shocks. And I think maybe that also might help disentangle this puzzle that seems to be emerging. We've spoken a little bit about this, about the sort of lower than expected migration response to flood shocks. If there's a sort of anticipation or even maybe optimistic bias that maybe my land is going to improve and I'm going to be more reluctant to move because I've got some sort of anticipation of increasing land productivity. So, and then just the other minor point was just in terms of the effects on household consumption of these price increases. You said sort of onions and tomatoes, they're not very calorically dense, right? So how much of household budget is dedicated to these food items? And even if you assume no adjustment in household consumption, the quantity of household consumption, how big of a shock on household welfare would that be? But because I think they're condiments rather than staples, the households could adjust their consumption downwards and sort of smooth that shock, at least in the short term, which is consistent with what you're showing. Thanks so much.
I'm Takashi Kurosaki, and very interesting presentation. And I'm a very old person, so 30 years ago, I used the same data set from Punjab markets for my dissertation. And at that time, there was no information at all about the source. So my question about the source in the price data, market data. First question is that how granular the source information? I don't think that the source corresponds exactly to the 132 mandis in Punjab. So if they are less granular, how did you do it? And the second question is that source, when you do a regression using the quantity, it is okay to distinguish by source. However, in the case of price, how does it make sense to distinguish by source? Do you Pakistani people separately identify banana from Larkana and banana from Nawab Shah, for example? Banana from northern Sindh may be enough in the market price formation. So you should consider about that for the case of price regulation, because the price for the same commodity in the same market should be very similar regardless of the source. That is my second point. Thank you.
I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Dr. Gamzeli from IBA. I teach special economics. So as Eamon has already highlighted about the special spillovers, so we can discuss later about like the methodology about network analysis and further what we can do. So just I wanted to add this comment that we can discuss further.
Hello, Haris, I'm working as a consultant with ADB. It was an excellent presentation. Most of the points were covered by Eamon, so I'll just add one or two. The first thing about the storage facilities. So at the farmer level, there are little to no storage facilities, and when it comes down to the markets, as you talked about the AMS 132 markets, I got a chance to visit around 100 markets in 2022, and what I saw was the auctioneers, the commission agents, which we call as Arti, so they happen to be the owners of those storage facilities. So the prices of commodities has a strong linkage with the storage price as well as the auction price, because they get to decide what has to be the price. And then the road network that you talked about, another thing would be interesting to know the market distance from the main roads, because it has a great link. And then to the farm level, as Eamon talked about already about that. And then last about the weather warnings. So the weather warnings, there has to be a linkage between the cultivation and the harvesting time, because the weather warnings currently from the department is not really trustworthy. So a recommendation at the end of the paper on this would be great. Thank you.
Awesome, great. Thank you for all your comments. I think these are very useful, and we got a lot of to-dos to work on. In the interest of time, I don't think I'll be able to go over all the comments, but happy to chat later. Very quickly, Takashi, you're right that this data has source. So currently the source is not very well defined in terms of the unit. Sometimes it's a whole tehsil, sometimes it's a whole district. So what we're doing is we are essentially aggregating our flood data to the level at which it is used by the agriculture department. So if the agriculture department says that the source is the whole tehsil, so we try to look at what's the flood concentration in the whole tehsil. If it says that the source is the whole district, then we try to aggregate it to that level, and that's how we are sort of defining the source at that thing. In terms of the response on prices, you're absolutely right that the consumers don't care about where the supply is coming from. All they care about is they're buying the item. I think what we are trying to get at, and this is where we need to refine our measure of flood and how we introduce it, especially in these price regressions. So we are mainly trying to look at the impact on prices as a function of the exposure to the flooded sources. So I think what we were doing earlier in this work is to develop the exposure, measure of exposure, just like it is used in this literature on market competition. Looking at how each of our market, how much of each of market was exposed to the sources which were flooded, and once we have that measure, then we can look at what's the effect or likely effect on the prices in terms of your exposure to the flooded sources, right? So that's how sort of we are looking at or trying to look at how the prices may have been affected because of that. But I think the Eamon's point on that is absolutely valid, that these are general equilibrium concerns, right? If a price increases in Lahore, all the neighboring markets respond, right? So even though Lahore might be hit more by the flood, Lahore might have been more affected by the sources which are now flooded. And the other sources are sort of, there's this arbitrage going on. We have another project, we are looking at this interspatial arbitrage opportunities that exist in these markets. So that really is there, and we can see these supply adjusting and these prices adjusting across these markets. So that's the challenge I think we have in this paper, and something we're working on, and hopefully in the next presentation that we give you, we will have more results on this. But I'm running out of time, so let me stop here and thank you for all your comments. Isra, you are next now. Thank you.
Can I have that? So. Hi everyone, so I'm Isra. I'm going to be presenting on our paper, Beliefs, Signal Quality and Information Sources, Experimental Evidence on Air Quality in Pakistan. So at this point, I think most of us are aware that Lahore experiences some of the worst air quality in the world. It routinely ranks amongst the top 3 most polluted cities in the world. During this time, because it's peak smog season, we do see a lot of interest and attention from policymakers and media and civil society, but this is an issue which Lahore deals with throughout the year, in the sense that we're never really at good or satisfactory levels of air quality, if you will. In terms of literature, there is a lot of demand for air quality information and avoidance strategies. We're building on previous study done by my co-authors and Ahmed et al., where they looked at basically demand for air quality information. So for consumers, especially in Pakistan's context, they can get information from multiple sources. One of them would be from the government. In this case, Punjab, we're looking at the Environment Protection Department. The problem with that is that either they're mostly unreliable or they're missing, or they're inaccessible in the sense that their information is available as PDFs in English, which is not really usable for the average person, especially if they don't know English. And then we have also and because of this sort of unreliable or missing observations that you might get from the government, you do have NGOs and other agencies that have started providing air quality information. The one of which we are looking at is PAQI, which crowdsources air quality information, and they publish their information either online on their website, on their apps, or even on Twitter. So this is a map where I'm mapping basically daily PM 2.5 values of throughout, basically for different sources. So the blue one is the US Embassy. That's what we treat as our truth, so to speak, which we think is the most accurate source of air pollution level. If you notice the green line for EPD, in the beginning, it's basically missing for the entire month of December, which is basically mostly our peak smog season. So this is adding to what I was saying in the sense that they're sometimes missing. The horizontal lines, that 15 and 35, the 15 is basically what the WHO says, like the daily standard of what's sort of acceptable. And then 35 is what the EPDs reports in their daily reports that they upload. And if you notice that specifically for Lahore, there's barely any days where it even touches 15. So it's an issue for us that's we have to deal with, and we shouldn't just pay attention to it just during smog season. Coming back to what we're specifically looking at, we're sort of, because our consumers can get information from different sources, their demand for air quality information from a given source then can depend upon either their beliefs about the air quality, about the sources, service quality itself, is how accurate is it, how reliable is it, and just their innate preferences for the source itself. So maybe they have certain biases towards the government or towards private sources. In terms of what our research question specifically is, so we're firstly looking at, okay, are consumers even willing to pay for this type of air quality information? Is there even positive demand? Then we're going to look at, okay, how does the source affect the demand for this type of information? Do they have or do they form beliefs about air quality levels, about the accuracy of the given source, or is there any preferences even between sources? How do they vary? Is there any differential there? So the study was, this is like the experimental design for a study. So we randomized 10 households between two arms. There's no pure control group. They're split evenly between the government arm and the private arm. They were sent a daily SMS message from February to June 2023, in which we provided them day T, basically air quality levels, so PM 2.5 concentration levels were given to them. And then we made an ensemble forecast model where we also provided them day ahead, so day T plus 1. This is going to be the air pollution level. And then we used this, and then we conducted baseline and endline, and we played certain sort of incentivized games with them to elicit their demand and their beliefs, so to speak. So this is a snapshot of the messages that they were receiving. They're exactly the same. The information provided is exactly the same. The only thing that's different is that in one, the people who are in the government arm, it says data provided from the government or EPD, and for the private arm, we would say data sources PAQI. So we had 4 pre-specified outcomes. The first is what I mentioned in the sense that do people have a positive demand for air quality information. We do this via BDM method, where at an end line, we basically have them bid for how much they would be willing to pay for an additional 2 months of this service. We also, in baseline and end line, play a sort of forecast game with them, if you will, where we provide them with a forecast table, where they're shown the mean in the past week of the PM 2.5 concentration levels and the minimum and maximum, and they were asked them to forecast what they think would be the pollution level on the next day. We do this both in baseline and endline. And then in endline, we also try to gauge what they think is the accuracy of the service we're providing them. So we have them also guess what they think the service will say is going to be tomorrow's air pollution level. Lastly, we also look at the relative preference between government and private. So this is done in both baseline and endline. We do this via a donation game where we give them 100 rupees and we ask them how they would like to donate this money between a government agency or private agency that's working towards air quality initiatives. So for outcome one, which is do they have positive willingness to pay, we test if it's positive. For the others, we see if there's any differentials by, for all four, we also look at if there's any differences by treatment. This is the regression that we're looking at, where ZI is just, it's 1 if you are in the government arm, and it's 0 if you're in the private arm. We also pre-specified some dimensions of heterogeneity in the sense that it's possible that it could vary based on people's baselines beliefs. So if they have strong priors or they're already exposed to, let's say, air quality information, they might be better at forecasting, and then the opposite would be true. So we might see more shifts in their, towards the truth and in endline if they were, let's say, if they were not as exposed to this sort of information. And then in general, we also try to see if maybe they just have prior beliefs about the government or private sources themselves. So for outcome one, in terms of demand for air quality information, we found that consumers are actually willing to pay about 238 rupees for an additional 2 months of the service. This does not vary between treatment arms, if you look at column 2. We also looked at potential avoidance behaviors and policy preferences. Those also do not vary between treatments. In the interest of time, I won't go into it, but basically we looked at time use, how much time are they going to spend outdoors, do they have a preference for a particular policy, so education versus air quality or health versus air quality, we don't see any differences in those. Why is there no potential difference in willingness to pay between the two treatment arms? It's possible that they're satisfied with the service. We did ask them specific questions in endline. Were you overall satisfied with the service? How, in terms of reliability, in terms of accuracy, we made indexes, and we didn't see any differences in those. And it's also possible that consumers just have weak priors. So now that they've been exposed to a particular source of information, they're just generally satisfied with it. So they have malleable preferences, if you will. We also then outcome 3, which is, outcome 2, which is beliefs about air quality levels. So this pertains to the forecast game we played with them. So if you look at column 3, there's no difference between forecast accuracy between the two treatment arms. Both people in both of them are relatively, have the same amount of forecast error, if you will, almost. We do, however, see difference in terms of heterogeneity by baseline forecast accuracy. So people who were worse at forecasting at baseline, we see a greater improvement in them, in their forecasting in endline is about 0.22, and it's significant over there. In terms of people's perceived accuracy of air quality information, so this is to do with how do they perceive the accuracy of the service that we're providing, so the SMS error. We see that consumers believe that the government forecasts are slightly less accurate. How do I sort of consolidate both these things with the SMS error and the forecast error? We think that it's possible that higher error individuals with government information update their beliefs about air quality less than those with private. They believe that the information is less accurate. And this sort of adds to the, perhaps it adds to the idea that it's possible that even though they don't have different willingness to pay, they're still willing to change their beliefs about the source themselves somewhat. But this, so far I've only talked about, say, consumers' preferences or beliefs for a given source. How do these preferences shift between sources? So this was done via the donation game. So at baseline, it was basically a 50-50 split between people giving 50 rupees to the EPD and the private source. But at endline, we saw a drastic, almost a 75-25 shift. So the source that they were exposed to, they predominantly shifted their donations towards it. Even in terms of stated preference measures, so we saw that there was an increase in approval for the source that they were assigned to in terms of they felt it was more reliable, in terms of accuracy, and just their overall satisfaction with that particular source. We even asked them, okay, hypothetically, how much they would be willing to pay for the SMS forecast coming from the other source, and willingness to pay is significantly 16 rupees lower. So they're willing to pay less for the source that they were not assigned to, but more to the one they were assigned to. How do we consolidate this in terms of just conclusions, if you will? So there is a strong demand for air quality information. We know it's positive. So you might be able to even scale this up if governments and private sectors are willing to somewhat work together on this, because we're seeing that there's no differential impacts. So there is scope for some private-public cooperation here. We find differing beliefs about information quality by source. So people do think that the government error is higher. It's possible that there needs to be more work done for us, specifically in that maybe people don't value accuracy as much as they do the service as a whole. Maybe they don't think there's too much of a, so if it's off by 5 or 10 points, it's not so bad, because we sort of look at air quality in the sense of, is it good, satisfactory, or is it hazardous? So maybe they might not be giving as much value to just precision as itself. And that we are also seeing that consumers prefer the source they are exposed to. They generally have weak priors, and they have malleable preferences, if you will. With that, I'm going to end, and if you have questions, please let me know.
All right, thank you, Isra. I think it was wonderful to read this paper, and one reason is that Samuel has been talking about this paper at many instances, so it was a great opportunity to finally go over it in detail. Just to quickly summarize what Isra has already said, basically there are 5 main questions that this research paper is trying to address. And first is, are people willing to pay for air quality information, right? So, and it's a very important question, right? In a setting where smog is everywhere, it's a public health issue, you really want to know if there is demand for such services, and the paper finds that yes, there is. People are willing to pay around 240 rupees for 2 months of service, right? So that's one of the important findings of this paper. Then they try to look at whether that information source, whether that demand or that willingness to pay changes depending on whether that information is coming from the government or coming from the private sources. And the motivation being that if it is coming from government, there might be lack of trust, or people might think, oh, government is trying to fudge with the data, they're trying to portray a good image by hiding what the actual level of air pollution might be. But it turns out from the demand perspective, from people's perspective, it really doesn't matter whether the information is coming from public or private. Similarly, whether their beliefs about the service quality is affected by the source of public or private. Again, there is very weak evidence of that, so depending on what definition of variable you use, people seem to not care a lot about, or do not seem to believe whether the service quality is going to vary. Similarly, beliefs about the air pollution, that again are not affected by the source. And finally, I think one of the very interesting results of this paper is, does exposure to information, like whether you were exposed to private information from private source or from the public source, does that affect your willingness to contribute or to donate to that particular source in the future? And they find that if you were sourced or if you were exposed to private information, then you tend to contribute more to the private sources, and if you were exposed to the public information, then you tend to contribute more to the public information, right? So to begin with, the preferences are sort of malleable, as the paper says, but then after being exposed, people tend to move in one way or the other. I think the paper is highly relevant and timely, given the settings that we are in, Lahore, smog, highly populated city. It's a global issue faced by the developing countries. So looking at how consumers value air pollution or how their beliefs are formed is super critical, and this paper does a really good job at placing itself right in the middle of that debate. I find that the methodology, particularly the randomized experiment and the use of incentive-compatible framing, that sort of really does a great job at coming up with a credible evidence. So that's I think that's very challenging. One thing that I find really great about the design is that how they can vary the information source while holding the quantity constant, right? So because otherwise, if you were not doing this in an experiment, then people may argue that the quality of information that the public information and the private information is not going to be comparable, right? But the paper does a great job at coming up with this measure of one quality and then just informing people that this information is based on public data or private data, and they're not using deception because both data are going into this. So I think that's very clever. And I feel like there's one comment that even though there are no effects, there are no differences in terms of whether the information is public or private, I think the paper can be more optimistic about that finding. It's encouraging finding that in a way that people are they're willing to pay for this service, and it doesn't really matter if it's coming from public or private sources. So I feel like that's a spin that you can give. So it makes it really policy relevant as well. So we need to get this information out to the public, right? I think this is more of a question. I don't know why you did not have this treatment where you don't give any source. So I think if you have a treatment where no source was given, you could have looked at impact of information alone, whether that information alone, irrespective of what the source is, how would that matter or not. So I don't know if you have another paper on that, but I feel like just looking at that alone would have been great. But of course, the experiment is now done, so I'm not sure how useful that question is now. One comment when I was reading this paper is I was wondering that there's likely to be interspatial variation in this PM 2.5 measure. And depending on which part of Lahore you are living in, your exposure to these particulate matters might be different. And that may affect how your beliefs are formed, what your willingness to pay is. And if I understand correctly, the paper is giving one reading for whole Lahore, and it doesn't account for how the interspatial variation might be. So that's something if you can, I think you have data to sort of get to that, so you know where people are living. So using that, you can sort of form some measure of their existing exposure to air pollution, and then look at how their beliefs are varying by that. I think that will be interesting. I don't know if you will have localized measure of air pollution. That depends on how many air monitors you have. But that's something that I think worth at least addressing to whatever extent you can. And I think it also has implication on if you're interpreting the readings from US Consular Journal as truth. Again, I think because that's one location and these monitors are placed in different locations. So I think the variation that you're expecting or that you're observing might be because they're placed in different locations. So overall, I think the spatial variation is something that can be addressed more, in this paper. This may be a cheap shot, but I think whenever we do experiments, there's this the concern about the demand effects, right? And this is a setting where people know that they're part of the study. And they know that it might be socially acceptable to come across as environmentally conscious, or to have that, or to portray that image. Or there's a social desirability bias that might be there. So that's something that I think even you may not be able to address that fully, but I think whatever evidence or you want to think about how further you can sort of address concerns about these demand effects or social desirability effects that people may have. And I find this particularly concerning because right before you elicit this willingness to pay, you remind them that you were given this information by the public or the private. So this is made salient to them, and I don't know what people might be perceiving that what you want them to say because you're reminding them of that information, right? So it could bias their beliefs in one way or the other. So that's something maybe you want to think about. Another thing is about this 400 maximum bid that you sort of give them that this is the maximum you can go. And of course, there's a lot of literature in behavioral economics about anchoring effect, that people, once you give them an anchor, they sort of start to think around that. And maybe you're observing this 200 plus willingness to pay that could be driven to some extent by this anchor. And if this anchor wasn't there, then it might be a different willingness to pay. So maybe that's something you want to think about. Right. The paper, the version that I saw, there weren't, I think you haven't looked at the behavioral outcome at that time, but now that you have, so I'm going to skip over that. I was hoping that there will be more action happening on that end, but it looks like the effects are not really there. I don't know in the setting if it is possible to observe revealed outcomes, whether they are sort of actually changing their behavior. Of course, it's very challenging. You do have one measure where you ask them about whether they have the mask available at this point. So I think that's good, but if you could have more outcomes in terms of how their real behavior is being changed, that would have made this paper even better. Right? This is just, I think I really liked this result on polarization. So again, I think I commented a bit about this earlier as well, but there is a stark polarization of preferences. Depending on which source you're exposed to, people tend to contribute more to that source. I think it's worth getting into the explanation of that. Why is it that people are sort of moving, or what is causing these preferences to form, right? Because to begin with, there is no preference for either source, and then at the end line, you observe that there is stark polarization of preferences happening. So what might be the explanation? There could be various, I think, explanations. There's a confirmation bias. There's an echo chamber bias. It could be that they trust a particular source that they're exposed to more now. There's social identity theory that can help you answer that question, that now you're more like a private person or the public person. Or there's, maybe this is, you already have addressed, that there is no perceived, there's no differences in service quality, source quality. But I think it's worth something, it's worth getting into. There are a few other concerns, one being that I'm also concerned about the timing of this thing. So your end line is happening in May to June. That's when the air quality seemed to be. I know the particulate matters are still there, but it's not very observable, and it seemed like the quality is not that bad. I was just wondering whether if you were doing this in the smog season, maybe around this time, would that affect the willingness to pay and how beliefs are being formed? Or would people be more sensitive to this sort of information? Right, so let me just stop here. But overall, I think it was a wonderful paper to read, and it adds a lot to our understanding of how people think about environmental services. Thank you. Isra, up to you if you want to respond to anything, or we can take more questions.
I can respond to a few of your questions. So you're right, we can be a bit more optimistic in the whole private and public cooperation possibility in terms of how we frame it. We did not add a pure control because the previous study, which was I mentioned in the presentation, Ahmed et al. Did already look at this in terms of that. And then we were mostly interested in looking at the differential effects of the sources and how that might affect or could affect the demand for air quality information. So that was more of the aim of this paper. In terms of exposure that we're just providing one reading, we try to, yes, the US consulate did go into the ensemble forecast, but we also used other monitors which are more closer to our locations, which are NA 123, 124. That's not, that I do get what you were saying, but there are capacity constraints on how many monitors we were able to access. So that was one thing we did have to take into consideration. As for people wanting to appear more socially desirable, or maybe they wanted to appear a certain way in that sense, we did look at people generally, for once it was balanced in that sense, but it is something we can look into, that perhaps it might have prompted people to respond in a certain way. But from our baseline characteristics, we did see that most of the people were not that interested in air quality information to begin with, or they weren't that exposed towards it. So what they would even consider socially acceptable answers is something to consider, I suppose. As for why we set the bid at 400, when we piloted this, we actually piloted it with a bid at 300, and we saw that a lot of people were bidding close to the 300 mark already. So then we anchored it above, a bit higher at 400 to see if maybe it will go near 400, and it did not. So we don't think that that specific setting of that bid is going to really affect it, because it was much below. It's at 238. In terms of revealed outcomes, we did look at mask use, and we did look at time use of how much time they're spending outdoors. We did not see any significant effects of these. We also looked at if people are willing to complain to the EPD about poor air quality. There was no real significant effects for those either. I think I got everything, I think. Yeah. If there are any other questions.
Please, go ahead.
Great paper, very relevant, very timely. A couple of quick comments. I think it would be useful to have some profiling information on who are the people that you talk to, who are in your sample, like what's their education, do they have another person in the family who might have asthma or might have some kind of a medical condition that is affecting the demand for that information. Could be useful. Another question that perhaps could be asked is that do you actually own an air purifier? And then see, if you have an air purifier, then how does that change your preference for paying more or less or demand for this? And my first comment was also because if this paper is being used by someone in a private sector to maybe create a service, they would like to know how big is this market. It's fine that people are willing to pay 240 rupees, but what's the percentage of those people who will pay 240 in the whole of Lahore? And that's why that profiling information is important. I was curious as to why you didn't use AQI in your experiment, because AQI is also a big source of, people just Google it and usually it's at the top of your search results. So I'm not sure why AQI was not included in this. And finally, just a sort of, a cynical comment. I think maybe one thing that's going on is that the reason accuracy doesn't matter and people really don't prefer if one source is accurate versus another is exactly because of the graph you showed. It's so out of whack. Why does it matter if you are 5% better or 10% better? I mean, you're already off the charts, so it doesn't really matter as long as you're getting some indication of, what their quality index is. That's all what you need. Thank you.
You can pass it on the back, please.
Hi, my name's Fiza. I'm from Serb. I had a specific question about your donation game. So in all of these dictator games, ultimatum games, there's a huge literature on how the person perceives their own socioeconomic status and how much they're willing to give, right? So I was sort of wondering if you guys looked at any of the effect of their socioeconomic status, whether implicitly their income or whatever, or whether how they perceive themselves on how much they were willing to donate to the source. And secondly, sort of building upon the previous comment, government, you gave the exact same data, just different source, right? But the government, one of the extra things that the government does is you have those messages on when you call somebody that, oh, smog is happening, so you should cover your face and blah, 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 right? So I was wondering if there's some sort of further work that you guys are looking at, sort of providing that, like not just, oh, this is the X point of the air quality, but oh, you should also do this to make it better, or buy an air purifier or whatever, that sort of thing.
I have a mic. It's okay. Thanks. So I think one thing I wanted to point out is that it seems that there's a lot of discussion on how source doesn't matter, but it also seems that at baseline, these people didn't really use this information. You come and you give them an information, and then they just trust it, and then they have a preference for sticking with it because they would rather donate to it, which shows that there is what source to introduce someone to, because there's some work that they put into interpreting that message, and then now they get used to seeing the same type of message, and they know what number to focus on because they know what the other text is, what the source is. There's some habit formation that it seems is going on, but that has an important implication that maybe source does matter. Like, it matters what source you introduce them to, because now they're just going to stick with it. And so I was wondering if you had, thoughts on that. And then I also agreed that it might be interesting from a price discrimination point of view to try to understand the distribution of willingness to pay by profiles of people. Like, is it the people with asthmatic problems, with children, people who work more outside that have higher willingness to pay? I think some of that distributional work would be really cool.
So your question, first of all, in the sense that we did ask people if they had asthma, etc., but we had very few observations, less than 2%. So that was not really something we could do here. In terms of asking people if they owned an air purifier or not, we're looking at households which are very low income. So, and we do have information on their, let's say, asset index. That's what we balanced on. But I do not think that they would actually own an air purifier because they're relatively expensive. We're looking at low-income households here. So, but I do take your point in that if we do this again, we should have more profiling information so that if government or private sources want to scale this up, they have something to base it against. Why didn't we not use the AQI? I think it was because we were mostly wanting to target with PM 2.5, because when we did the baseline, we provided them with information on what PM 2.5 is, what AQI is, and we introduced PM 2.5 specifically because we wanted to send them messages for concentration, because that's the more accurate way of looking at it.
Isra, can I just add
Yeah.
to that? It's a good question, but the PM 2.5 is, so if you look at AQI, so it's like a weighted index of pollutants. PM 2.5 actually has the highest weight. And so as Isra said at the beginning, we basically, before at baseline, we provided them pamphlets which kind of describe exactly what PM 2.5 is. So it's easier to explain what PM 2.5 as a particle is and what its size is, and relative to AQI, because then those explanations of weighted indices become much more complicated.
And then I think Fiza asked about the socioeconomic status and how they perceive themselves. We did not, we did ask them, okay, how do they think they compare, how in terms of income, where do they fall in the neighborhood? So we do have a general sense of where they do place themselves, but we didn't specifically ask them, how they're into those extent though. And then Eamon's question about habit formation. So I do agree with you, because they were not exposed to these sources. So we do acknowledge this in the paper that these are probably short-term effects. And as they become more and more exposed and more parties enter into the market, they're likely to develop a more nuanced understanding of which source they prefer. But because this is an experimental study and it was short-term in nature, this is what we're seeing. Okay.
There are no more questions? Then, okay.
I have just a question about methodology. So you mentioned about the stated preference. So I was expecting that, did you use a choice card and use the random utility maximization models and to find out these results? No.
For stated preference, you mean in terms of the satisfaction or the accuracy ones? We use Likert scales in those questions, and then we used a standardized index, and then we put them into the regression. So we did not use those models, but we are looking at sort of adding models to our paper right now. That's something we're trying to work towards.
Yeah, because I was just mentioning, because we worked recently on like a choice experiment for marine plastic pollution reduction. That was like a whole big survey in North Atlantic. We can discuss later on this. And secondly, when you are mentioning about the 400, like the amount, the bid amount, I was thinking about the hypothetical bias. So, like, I think you know it about this. Can you explain, like, was there anything that you used, any question or something to control that thing in the survey?
Can you repeat?
So simply the hypothetical bias tells us in the stated preference methodologies that generally when we ask respondents, are you willing to pay, they usually say they are willing to pay.
Yeah.
But in the stated preference, we also use questions, or like like we just acknowledgement questions. They tell that once you respond to these, like the bid amount, we can. It was not
incentivizer. Yeah.
No, we use. I
No, those are separate. We
Oh,
also
separate.
asked, those are separate questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, okay.
All right, let me thank everyone for being here. It was great to have all these discussions.